Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of June, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. And we will start today's video or continue and discuss directly with the peace settlement plan, which was provided yesterday by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Let me remind you that yesterday, during a meeting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a list of, let's say, conditions was announced, under which the Russian country is ready to sit down at the negotiating table with Ukraine, most importantly to ceasefire and allow Ukrainian units to safely withdraw from the line of contact, let's say, somewhere in the direction of western, central Ukraine and so on and so forth. One of the conditions that was set by the President, more precisely, is the first and most important. It is the withdrawal of Ukrainian units from the territory of the DPIE, LPR, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. And of course, after this plan was announced. This plan was announced right on the eve of the World Summit, which was currently organized and is being held on the territory of Switzerland. This peace summit was organized by the Ukrainian side. 92 states, 8 organizations, including 57 states out of these 92, were represented at this summit. At the highest level, according to the data that are publicly available in open sources, taking part in this summit. That is, there were either presidents or prime ministers. This is a very important phenomenon in fact, since the presence of the heads of state of these 57 states, first of all, let's say, legalizes Zelensky in the eyes of Western countries. In other words, I remind you that on the 20th of the 21st of May, his powers ended. Now his presidential powers are being extended with the extension of martial law. And this summit and meetings at such a high level, first of all, let's say, whitens Zelensky in her eyes. And they will fully support and recognize him as the president of Ukraine. Although, let's say, Putin at the same time, when the requirements and conditions for the start of peace talks were published, hinted that Zelensky would not negotiate, but negotiations would be conducted with the legitimate government in Ukraine, which is the Verkhovna Rada, at least according to the understanding of the representations of the Russian Federation. So, after Putin's plan was announced, naturally, Western countries began to discuss it widely. They discussed it everywhere, in all corners, and immediately the first reaction began to appear. For example, if we turn to our overseas partners, for example, the representative of, let's say, the United States of America at the United Nations reported that this plan is unacceptable. And immediately there was a reaction to this reaction from the Russian side, from Vasily Nebenzhy, who said that if the West and Kiev do not accept, or rather refuse, let's say, the Russian peace proposal, then all political and moral responsibility for the further, let's say, meat grinder will lie precisely on the shoulders of these all who will make such decisions. And in general, we see that the first reaction was refusal. However, after we walked around Switzerland, we walked, ate, maybe drank a little, took pictures. And after all these events, the position has changed slightly. But the updated position has already begun, let's say, to express not even Zelensky, but Ermak. You probably know, are familiar with this man, at least for the last 2 or 3 weeks, all Western media have been writing about him, as a kind of grey cardinal in Ukraine, who actually, according to Western sources, runs the country. In other words, even some sources say that he has more power than Zelensky. And at least Zelensky will listen very often, perhaps even does as he says. Well, it's all probably just rumors, maybe just some kind of incomprehensible. So after lunch, the opinion has changed in Western countries as a whole. Now they are talking about the fact that yes, today we are holding the first, let's say, peace summit on Ukraine, and after a while we will hold the second one. And we will try to make Russia come to the second summit. We have already started some negotiations with her. In other words, in fact, nothing is clear, nothing has been decided, nothing was clear. And as we see with you, especially military operation continues, the fighting continues, and does not stop for a second. Well, let's move on to the line of combat contact. Let's start the Sumy region. Here, as you can see, there are no icons, as if saying some kind of warfare, but there are a couple of important points here. According to Western cartographers. According to Western cartographers, Ukrainian units were transferred to the Sumy direction to strengthen and combat possible Russian saboteurs, and possible with the first deterrent of the Russian offensive. Parts of the 31st Mechanized Brigade, which are likely to be the basis. The support of defense in this direction in the area of the settlements of Vorozhba, Tetkina, here is Rizhevka, where the settlement, which came under the control of Russian units during the recent offensive. And units of the 48th Artillery Brigade have also been deployed, most likely also to support the 31st Brigade. In other words, there is some small movement, somehow, despite the fact that there is a constant assurance from the Ukrainian side that nothing will work for the Russian side here. We are still seeing some strengthening and the transfer of personnel. If we talk about the Kharkiv direction, there is important news here, very important, which I would like to discuss. The first thing worth discussing is, of course, everything at the deep point, which the armed forces of Ukraine tried to storm several times during the week, as the 42nd Brigade with the 3rd Battalion, as the 13th Brigade. According to Russian sources, all attacks were repulsed, you suffered high losses. And today we are publishing footage of drone strikes on the positions of Russian units of these small buildings, a small farm. Let me remind you that a week ago, we painted the territory into a gray zone, since it was through these fields, let's say, that the Ukrainian Bradley drove, struck at the positions of the Russian army along Druzhby Street. But today, we see the cadres of Russian units here again, that is, we have regained control back. No more news. In general, the official channels of the North Group of Forces confirm that the overall situation remains unchanged. And, by the way, today, probably for the first time in the last week, no information has been received from the village of Zeleny. Either they changed their plans, or they managed to somehow seriously expand the control zone, and, in general, the map should have been updated a long time ago. We just don't have any geolocations that could be used. Then we go with you to Volchansky. Here, of course, is another day, another simply terrible scandal. A scandal of such a level, which has probably never happened before. Perhaps for the entire introduction of a special military operation. A very terrible and very incomprehensible scandal, some kind of conflict that I would like to discuss in detail. And so that you clearly understand what is happening. Let me remind you that these days there was a very heated discussion of the situation in the area of the aggregate plant. Yes, the Volchansk aggregate plant. Let me remind you that a few days ago, Deep State's Ukrainian cartographers updated the map and showed the aggregate plant in red. That is, in the color of control of Russian units. And then there was a small gray area between the Russian positions, for example, along the shopping street, Taras Shevchenko Street. That is, in fact, Pushkin Street. Here is some part of Sobornaya Street, some part of Gagarin Street, were in the gray zone. And Ukrainian sources began to spread information that Russian units managed to enter the aggregate plant during the assault. But later they were cut off by units of the 71st Yager Brigade. When trying to counterattack, let's say so, in the southwestern direction. That is, but. In other words, such a story began in general, and Ukrainian sources picked up this information. They also began to spread that Russian units were surrounded. Then after that, separately, pro-Russian sources picked up this information, also began to spread it, that Russian units were cut off. There is still no way to restore, and so on and so forth. But today, on the whole, I have put all the dots on and, let's say, the grouping of the troops of the North. They have already published the final, let's say, such information, and here is their position. The official position of the Ministry of Defense, let's say, the Russian Federation, with regard to the aggregate plant. The enemy, just the beginning. Such an enemy. That is, not even Ukrainian sources, but the enemy. In other words, it is very important to understand here that in general, anyone who distributes information is already an enemy in advance, even if you do not work, let's say, for the Ukrainian Sepsoli, intelligence and so on. The enemy disperses information about the alleged encirclement of units of the North grouping in the area of the aggregate plant, referring to some unknown military officers, based on the map data associated with the main intelligence directorate of the resource. Someone made an erroneous conclusion that Russian fighters were surrounded, which is not true. The fighters of the Northerners fully control the approaches to the plant and provide the assault units with everything necessary. Ukrainian propaganda once again gives out a desire. That is, and the like. After which this publication of this news, of course, all pro-Russian sources began to gradually delete posts. Or disappear altogether, and try not to comment on this situation anymore, because everyone clearly understands that this is possible fraught with great troubles and consequences. In other words, this is the kind of story that happens here, that you just meant. That Russian official sources today completely refuted any information about allegedly certain environs of Volchansk. All this is speculation, arguments, and incomprehensible work, as stated in the post, of enemy resources. But if we return to Earth with you and try to understand what is happening here according to geolocations, and not just publications, and the transfer of artillery dual posts by posts. In other words, there are several geolocations that generally confirm that, yes, indeed, the control is under the full control of Russian units. And the footage was published today by the APU, it was published today. Let's say that in these seconds we can observe the Volchanskaya citadel with you. Here is a Ukrainian soldier standing here who explains how. What is happening now, how the fighting is taking place, and here shows a building that is completely destroyed. In fact, the individual spans were folded as a result of a blow to either Faba or Kaba or Solnsepikov. In these frames, you can observe the work of the IF with drones on the units of the Russian army, and there, in the last seconds, the progress of the Russian tank is shown, according to which the Ukrainians are also working with grenade drops. And if everything sums up all geolocations, then the mod. That's where they were. The first building in the first seconds were shown right here. This building, this span in the center, was destroyed, and, well, this span was demolished. In other words, these shots show that while this part of the citadel is most likely under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, but the Russian military is trying to completely destroy the building in order to somehow clear the way for further progress. Ukrainian drones worked with discounts in the beer of drones in this particular part. In the area of Volchanskaya Road, here is the VPZ Volchansk 6, so some kind of mail is possible. In other words, it is here, and you and I see that these are, in fact, approaches to the aggregate plant. In other words, Russian soldiers moved here. Here, somewhere here, they ran between buildings, tried. They ran from one building to another, and Ukrainian disembodied workers worked here. Which in general confirms the fact that, yes, there is indeed a corridor between the Volchansk plant and, let's say, the mainland, along which it is possible to supply and, let's say, support the grouping of Russian assault units in the aggregate plant itself. Although so far, we have not received a single frame from the factory itself. And the video was there in the last promotion of the Russian tank. The Russian tank was moving along the spiritual street. There was a displacement here. Also, Ukrainian drones worked with discounts. And based on all these geolocations, we have updated the map and have just shown this territory, which is flickering before your eyes. As additional progress, additional advancement of Russian units over the past day, or two, or several days. It is also worth noting very important information that for several days in a row, Russian sources have been spreading information about the most serious strengthening of the North group of troops in the Kharkiv direction. Either there was a rotation, or reinforcements were really pulled up, or fresh forces were introduced into the battle, but it is precisely due to the introduction of additional resources, reserves into the battle, that a possible further acceleration of progress is noted, and that now everything will be much faster and faster. But in general, it should be noted that despite the resistance, despite the fierce fighting, even Ukrainian and Russian sources, among others, confirm that Russian units control the aggregate plant by 40%. 40-50 it was as of this morning. That is, there is actually significant promotion, significant control. That's 40% according to the North group of troops. The Russian unit controls the aggregate plant by 40%. That is, in any case, where there are 40, there are 50, 60, and perhaps 100. And of course, after the fall of the aggregate plant as a whole, the citadel will be formed automatically. And also the grouping of troops of the North claims that over the past day the AFU has established crossings and transferred a significant number of units to Severovolchansk in order to organize counterattacks and, let's say, unblocking the AFU units located in the citadel itself. In other words, here is such an interesting story. We will watch how it ends. But in fact, Even if we summarize everything again and move away, then yes, here we see with you. Definitely very serious fierce battles are going on. The high provides significant resistance. The front line in Volchansk itself is this configuration. It has not changed for 2 weeks. In other words, neither one nor the other side is able to take, well, at least, judging by the change in the front line, to take the initiative into their own hands. Although everything may change as much as possible in the near future, and we can absolutely observe the same situation here. That occurred in the settlement of Georgiivka, firm where we did not receive any information at all for a month. And then one day, as we discussed with you yesterday, a large number of shots were published, as Russian units not only took control of Georgiivka, but have already begun to consolidate on the easternmost outskirts of Maximiliivka. In other words, the maximum silence regime was observed, and when the information came out, there was not just information. There was an update of the map, and a significant one in favor of the Russian army. Well, if we talk about South Volchansk, work continues on the destruction of equipment, on the destruction of reinforcements, and so on and so forth. It is also worth noting, very important, interesting posts according to counter-battery duels, counter-battery wrestling. Ukrainian sources report that the main burden and complexity, why it is so difficult to counterattack. It is not possible to somehow stabilize the situation here. This is really the superiority of Russian artillery guns. More precisely, the use of shells. The ratio, say, of artillery shells used in the Volchansk direction is 1:5. And even in some individual areas 1:7. And this is the first moment, and the second, that the entire territory is absolutely shot through, viewed by Russian intelligence drones, and simply do not even give the opportunity to pull up artillery as close as possible to the line of impact, and it is instantly destroyed. That is, well, such a situation, described from 2 sources. Then we are moving with you to the North Cup direction. There are no big changes here. Active military operations are underway, strikes are being carried out. All the same region, from the west of Stepovaya Novoselyovka, western Kislovka quotes, a counter-battery struggle is being waged. Strikes are being carried out on the main strongholds of the Apu along, let's say, the road at the intersection, along the Rockade, at the intersection of the Sandy Kislovka Railway and the N26 highway. But again without any attempts, perhaps, for the first time since the beginning of hostilities. The offensive on Stepovaya Novoselyovka is coming. Of interest, it is worth noting the attempts to advance Russian units in the direction of Berestovoy. Here, for example, there is information that there are even separate shots of Ukrainians launching drone strikes against the first assault units of the Russian army, which are trying to bypass the village of Peshanaya from the south. In these frames, we can observe a drone strike. The blow was struck here. From these frames, it can be assumed that the Russian units tried to attack Peshano by some kind of route like this. But the technique was hit, and the attack was thwarted. There are also shots of attempts, let's say, to reduce and improve, optimize the front line between Kazemovka and Berestov. The next attempts of Russian units to storm along this line will be published, and here were attempts to advance, the main purpose of which was to reduce the front line and take everything that is, let's say, on the right side of this strip. There are no more big changes there, or attempts to storm there as much as possible. Of interest, it is worth noting that at the moment, the Ukrainian side is working to restore, let's say, another dam in the area of the settlement of Oskol. This is where this dam was destroyed at one time by Ukrainian units in the 22nd year, when there was a retreat in order to flood the area and slow down the advance of Russian units. But now the Ukrainians themselves are restoring it, since they understand that in the near future, there are high risks of cutting in the direction of 2 parts with the exit of Russian units to the settlement of Borovaya. And now they are simply trying to solve logistical problems so that it is possible to supply the Afu grouping in the area of Turnov, Yampolovka, Yampol from all these settlements. Points. Now while there are some problems with this process. Then we are moving with you to the Razdel direction, where Russian units continue to storm the settlement of Razdelovka and clean up the surroundings, strongholds with the use of drones. There have been no advances on the ground over the past 24 hours, just some routine, military work. Then we are moving with you, a similar story will begin in a bright direction. There are several shots, separately pro-Ukrainian cartographers confirm full control over the forest. And a separate part of the railway between Bogdanovka and Chaz Yar itself, and this information came from Ukrainian sources. Russian sources, in turn, publish footage of another sunstroke. 98th publish footage of the application of, let's say, the hours of the Yarskaya Citadel and the last stronghold in the USU. In the direction you can see what power is flying there, Russian units are attacking here. But if we talk about the situation on Earth, there are no changes. Interesting information comes from Kleshivka. Let me remind you that over the past 2 weeks, Russian units have been conducting assault operations. As a result of offensive actions, Russian units managed to regain control over Kleshivka and Drivka. However, today, for some reason, pro-Ukrainian sources have again corrected the map and show Kleshivka in the gray zone. In other words, this suggests that according to some information that pro-Ukrainian cartographers have, for some reason, the Russian units decided to roll back from Kleshivka back in the direction of the railway. We have so far refuted or cannot confirm this information. Just for general understanding, for general reflection, what can happen there? Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction. Fighting continues here. The Russian army continues to expand the zone of control from Doni Tailev's Novoalexandrovka. And today a large amount of material was published, including from the German Bild, about what tasks, what plans are the main ones of the Russian army in this direction. And they say that to the main supply route of Pokrovsk, further east in the direction of Konstantinovka, Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, the Yara clock is at least 7 kilometers from the advanced Russian positions. In other words, we are talking about, let's say, this intersection. If we calculate the distance from Novoalexandrovka, from the extremely isolated positions of the Russian army, to the same intersection, then the distance here is 7 to 8 kilometers. In other words, Western sources are now starting to cry about this road, they are already sounding the alarm. And if the Russian army manages to get to this highway, then the supply of the AFU grouping in, let's say, Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, will be as difficult as possible. But again, today, by the way, out of the interesting things, it is worth paying attention to the report of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, according to which today, for the first time, the settlement of Vozdvizhenka, in my opinion, was included in the reports. In other words, this is the last settlement before this rockade, before this highway, before the N32 road. Well, here is the last settlement, the capture of which already opens up direct fire control, perhaps even artillery control over the road. And today, strikes were being carried out on the settlement, and either the 110th Brigade or the army was located there. Well, either 100 dozen, or, in my opinion, 100 according to the Ministry of Defense reports. And now the first blows were being struck here. You can even watch the 47th or 110th. But not the 47th, it is the 110th. The 47th is located in the area of the Falcon of the Sunrise of Yevgenyevka, where strikes were also noted. According to the Falcon, the expansion of the control zone is noted. Of the interesting shots, it is worth paying attention to the fact that the Russian army is already beginning, or has already begun attempts, to storm a company stronghold located north of Sokol. At the moment, it is recorded with the presence of Russian units on the Ukrainian side of the Samoylev beam. The beam was forced, it's like a swamp. Apparently, the first units of the Russian army are already in the very vicinity of this native stronghold. And Ukrainian drones of the 47th Mechanized Brigade have already started working on them. In other words, this is now the main focus of the Russian army. After overcoming this strong point, further advances will begin in the direction of Yevgenyevka-Voskhod. According to the 1st Novoselovka, according to Russian sources, the bridgehead around the village is already ready. And the Russian army from day to day, from minute to minute, perhaps in the near future, say next night, I will begin assault operations in the direction of the settlement itself. After that, in fact, this line of defense will also be passed. Let me remind you that this is considered the second line of defense after Avdiivka. The first line of defense was not the settlements of Pryatin, Solovyev, Berdik, Semenovka, Orlovka, Toninkaya, Umanskaya. This one, the line of defense was passed by Russian units in January, February, March, but since April through June, The Russian army has already overcome, in fact, the second line of defense, and is also coming to the end of this process. Interesting shots are obtained and information in the Snobry Ream. A large number of cartographers, both pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian, note the further progress of Russian units towards Yasnobrodovka. This stronghold has come under control. I also remind you that according to previous versions of the map, the Russian army entered this private building, among other things. That is, here in general, the Battle of Zasnobrodovka is also coming to an end, and in the near future. The settlement should come under the control of the Russian army. There are no changes in Krasnogorovka. What is worth paying attention to is the activation of artillery strikes on the northernmost, let's say, the central northern part of the settlement, in the area where the AFU still has the opportunity to hold its mortar calculations. As well as the greatest value of a specially military operation on both sides, these are operators and drones in Beer. Firmware strikes are already being carried out on the advancing positions of the Russian army inside Krasnogorskrovka. In other words, there is work going on, there is a counter-battery struggle. According to Georgiev, as we have said with you, there was complete silence for a month. And now a month has passed, and not just Georgievka is under the control of the Russian army, but well, even the battles for Maximilievka itself have already begun. Of the interesting things, it is worth paying attention to the expansion of a small control zone, or rather not even an extension, but a clarification, let's say, of the control south of the farms, say in the direction of the H15 road. In the footage, you can see the drone strikes published by the Ukrainian side on abandoned Russian equipment, most likely, which was thrown during the next assault. There is no news on Novomykhailovka Konstantinovka. Interesting information comes from the area of Vladimirovka. Remember, we have repeatedly discussed this artillery pockets and did not understand what was happening to him. On the one hand, we noted the advance of Russian units along the Sweet Line further to Vladimirovka and expanded the control zone. But with these farms, it was not clear. And today we receive information from Ukrainian sources that some of the units in these quarries were abandoned. Now they have fallen into the fodder. Apparently, these are some parts or units of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. And now negotiations are underway, either already, perhaps about surrender, or perhaps the Ukrainians are preparing to start trying to break through in the direction of Glidar Vodian. In other words, there is some interesting situation going on here. There is no news on the South Donetsk direction, on the Great Novoselovka. And here the only thing worth noting is the resumption of artillery strikes on the central and already slightly north of the central part of the harvest. In other words, in the near future, Russian units will make new attempts to expand the control zone in the central and straight to the northern part in order to squeeze the Viso completely out of the settlement. Note that the focus is gradually shifting as well. It is not shifting by tens of kilometers, but quarter by quarter it is moving north, 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 north. And this first of all confirms that the Russian units are also moving north along with this focus. Then we are moving with you to the Zaporozhye direction. Several frames are published here. In Gulyapol, according to, say, incoming information, a temporary deployment point of the 78th Battalion of the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade was discovered, in my opinion, in the 102nd Territorial Defense Zone. And this temporary deployment point was hit, most likely a missile strike, as a result of which a fire was formed, and possibly a warehouse was destroyed. No active actions on the ground. And there is a similar situation in the area of, say, Orkhov. There is no activity, except for a few published shots of strikes with the use of the sun. In other words, the situation as a whole is stable here, without any serious progress. And the same situation is observed in the Kherson direction. One gets the impression that, indeed, despite the fact that the Russian Federation was not invited to the peace summit in Switzerland, we are witnessing, perhaps another gesture of goodwill today and yesterday, that some large-scale offensives are about to be absent. That is, perhaps some small pause has been taken. Of course, it's not a stop, but a complete stop of hostilities, but just somehow to relieve tension in the network,